2 days ago, I did an interview with Brett Powers, and I'm still trying to get it uploaded. Actually, it was our second attempt at the interview, and what happened is that at a key point in the interview, and I was using purchased interviewing software, his audio dropped out. It was immediately after he warned that it was very likely that there was going to be a silencing of dissenters in this country, not just a censorship like shadow banning, not just alienation via mainstream media and propaganda, but as in going to prison. And perhaps that might look like a contrived situation, as in my opinion has happened to Rachel Brockett or Rach Ruby. As far as our experience of the interview, until the end of the interview, which is where we said goodbye, the signal was scratchy, but it was stable. It turns out that despite the fact that he had less bars than I did, it was actually my uploading to the cloud at my end, which was tougher. Anyway, that's probably TMI. Second thing I want to point out is during the interview, I was tired. I'd had a disturbed night the night before. Nothing bad had happened. I've got an old cat. I don't want to explain the details, but I care for this cat. I tell you, I was sorely tempted in the middle of the night to draw a line under this cat experience, but in the light of day, no. We need geriatric solutions for the old girl. Anyway, I was very tired, and my left eye is droopy. To my eye anyway. I mean, I look a bit haggard, but the left side of my face is drooping, which is not something I'm used to seeing in the mirror, although I think everybody pulls a bit of a face when they see themselves in the mirror. They're used to, like, giving themselves a muscular facelift. Maybe you don't look in the mirror, so it's not a problem for you. But I do wonder now, sometimes I see myself on camera and think, is that how I really look? But on this occasion, yeah, there was a drooping. Now, I had a significant left side brain injury. My story of awakening via betrayal by the system happened 20 years ago. So I'm interviewing people and their stories, and it's usually when they've stepped up to do the right thing and they felt that they would be supported, and then instead they were ambushed and blindsided, or they became the victim of injustice via the system, which is what happened to me, but in the public health system. So it took 5 years of me battling specifically to get a diagnosis on what my body was experiencing. By the time it happened, I really did think I was going to die. But the first symptoms actually showed up when I was 18. I was dishing. My left leg would flick out at a funny angle in the sprints and when I was weightlifting. And they said it was unusual, but nobody ever thought anything of it. I started to have some issues going downhill and getting my balance on surfboards and skiing and things in my early 20s, and immediately after, and I did mention this to doctors, and the fatigue. When I was 19, I started having issues with fatigue, which was written off as basically female emotional problems. So I was 30 before I was diagnosed with a brain tumour. I had 5 years of really suffering with it, to the point where I thought I'm on my way out, just asking for another day. And I had 4 children, 5 years old and under, when I was diagnosed. And about a year after, I attended maybe 9 months after, I attended an appointment with my neurosurgeon on such a pedestal, because I'd been convinced I was going to die. And he took a 60 cubic centimetre chondrosarcoma, which is a long bone tumour, out from within the linings of my brain. It was only the second time internationally that it had happened. I was extremely grateful. I felt he'd saved my life, and I always wanted to impress him and make him proud when I talked to him. And I told him that I was trying to run, so what I was doing was I was holding on very tightly to a treadmill. I was going to the gym, and I'd started to, myself, reactivate my leg and my foot in a way it hadn't been, and I'd love to teach the technique for how that happened sometime. It's a different story. But he actually wrote me up and said, "You're running, that's good." I said, "No, that's not what I said." And I was a bit baffled by that, but I didn't realise at the time. I had this sinking feeling, but I didn't really realise that entered into the record that I was completely fine. And at the end of 2021, I found an article he wrote about it in 2009, 6 years after the surgery. And And it confirmed that sinking feeling that I'd had, and it explained a lot about why doctors continued to see me as attention seeking when surely all my inquiries and my concerns about my health had been validated by what had happened, what had been discovered in my surgeries. But instead, into the decision tree, it was written that I was fine. There was nothing to see there, and I was far from fine. And that was the beginning of my awakening. Now, that happened because it could. There's no accountability, but things have gotten so much worse, which is where Brett's story is really amazing, because he's got chapters. He's gone rounds with the system over different issues. Listening to him was a privilege. I was honoured to hear his story, and I'm just disappointed that for whatever reason the tech let us down. I'm going to add in a screenshot just showing exactly where, because the section of transcript is there, and you can see our audio tracks. One is pink and one is green, and you can see that one of them drops off, and that is Brett, right when he said what he did. And then at the end of the video, please stay on the line, because I'm going to find some way of getting the information that he really urgently wants to share and hasn't been able to, despite us recording it twice now. That part has been cut out of the record. So I'm offline at the moment, just using none of my nice gear, just using my camera so I can get this together, because in some instances done is better than good. So thank you for your time, and please stay tuned.
Hi Brett, how are you doing?
I'm overwhelmed really with the response, from the action to go to Wellington and put the charges against Mr. Luxon. It's been overwhelming response. You don't normally get many views, of my posts, but this one's gone, it's just powering out there, getting great response. So that's a good thing.
So Brett, I'd really like to start with who you are, a bit about you, and then move through a bit of it chronologically, because you certainly have some current news which is really important to talk about.
Well, I spent my life in construction industry. I'm an engineering construction surveyor, and I'm probably one of the most experienced in New Zealand, because I've done many large-scale, multi-billion-dollar projects. And I can give you a list of those. If you went to Sydney, you might go to Dunedin Harbour, or if you'd been there a few years ago, you go on the monorail, or all the high-rise buildings there. I went to Sydney when I was a young guy after I graduated with a degree, and I got into large-scale projects. I just fell into them. So I ended up, most of the projects I was on were multi-billion-dollar projects, and I did that for 30 years. The last 5 years, 6 years, I was a consultant myself, with my own business, and I supplied know-how to do these projects, to big companies like Chevron, BHP, large-scale projects with large companies, and so, yeah, I understand about complexity of sites and plans, and I'm very good at retaining that information. I've also been involved in a lot of issues like 1080 and this whole COVID thing.
So when did you become involved in the pushback with regards to 1080?
Right at the beginning, when it first came here, around about 33 years ago, I was one of the people that started the movement. Well, I was a spokesperson back then in Taranaki. I spent many years researching in depth, what was going on. All my problems sort of started about 5 years ago when I took a court case against the government on that subject, on the subject of 1080 and its use in New Zealand. And as soon as I took that case in the courts, the judge, who I don't mind mentioning his name, Judge Gregg, he took the case, the 1080 case. And as soon as he got involved in that, I was in a divorce proceeding at that point in time. And the next thing, Judge Gregg turned up in my divorce proceeding, and then Judge Gregg did many illegal things, such as removing me from my my house, removing my ownership rights on the house. Yeah, they booted me out of my own house, which was a divorce settlement. My partner wasn't living in Australia, so the house was empty. And the police came and took me to the cells 5 times over a period of about 2 years. But I just want to speak about the actual 1080, because this is what people need to know about 1080. I'll tell you how they conned everybody. Yeah, okay. The whole thing was a con, because 1080 is a chemical that transforms into another chemical before it poisons you. Okay, so it doesn't stay the same 1080, which is sodium monofluoroacetate. That's what the chemical name of 1080 is. Now, there's this process called lethal transformation. What happens when a person or a possum or a bird or an insect get exposed to 1080, what happens? It goes into the body, and then by this process, once it's in the body, it transforms into another chemical called fluorocitrate. Fluorocitrate's what kills you, and that's the poison. 1080 itself is not poisonous in its own natural form, but it's the transformation into fluorocitrate, okay? That's where the poison is. The government did research with Dr. Charles Eason. He was the head scientist. So he did an experiment to see what happens when you put 1080 into river water. So he set up an experiment. He got the river water, and they dropped 1080 into the river water to see what happens. And what he found was every single molecule of 1080 transformed in that water over about 3 days into the actual poison, fluorocitrate. They measured, there was a direct relationship to the 1080 and the fluorocitrate, and they worked out it all transformed to the active poison called fluorocitrate. The reason for that was, quite simply, in the water were all these microorganisms. They took up the 1080, and as I explained earlier, the same process happened. The 1080 was transformed to the active poison and killed the microorganisms in there. But the water was now full, the active poison, fluorocitrate. And fluorocitrate is what does all the damage. So then the government came onto those water sources that they dropped the 1080 into our drinking water catchments, and they tested for 1080. But they never tested for the active poison, which was fluorocitrate, which was present in the water. 100% of the 1080 had transformed to nitrate. Everybody, country, has been getting diluted fluorocitrate. And there's many books out there or scientific studies on fluorocitrate. And it's shocking.
I was in Maruia when they did the triple dose. They tripled the dose of 1080. That's the headwaters for the Buller River, that you had dead fish and dead dolphins, and you had them washing up on the beach.
That's what happens. The big issue why 1080 is so bad is because of the fact that once it goes into the animal, it's transformed by lethal transformation into fluorocitrate. That's what kills them. So the bodies are always full of, their citrate levels are massively high. If you want to test for 1080, don't go testing for the substance 1080. Go test for fluorocitrate, which you'll find in, say, a possum gets poisoned. The 1080 has been transformed into fluorocitrate in the body, so the whole body becomes full of fluorocitrate. So when another animal or dog comes and licks the possum, it immediately dies from fluorocitrate poisoning, and then its body becomes full of fluorocitrate, and then an insect or a bird pecks on that, and then it dies. And then the same thing goes right through everything out, including the insects, which is why so many people talk about the quiet forest, you know.
Well, we have 40 hectares. We don't have it now, but on our 40 hectares, which was over 2/3 of it was regenerating bush, mature bush. There was pine forest and Douglas fir in patches, but most of it was bush. And it was a kind of a bush savanna, which actually really, really suits birds. The bird life was phenomenal on our property. It fell into silence. It fell into absolute silence.
It's an incredibly horrific weapon of war. It's listed in the book for chemical warfare, 1080. I mean, they invented it. There's no odor, it's colorless, it's tasteless, and it continues, it's going. Now, this is part of their whole agenda to poison us. The fact that nowhere else in the world uses that, such a horrific thing, but here in New Zealand, we put it into our water supplies. It is a teratogenic, which means it affects the unborn. That's the first really bad thing, because the fluorocitrate works on a cellular level, right through the whole body, goes into every cell, and what it does is it shuts down what they call a Krebs cycle, which is your energy production from your cell. So the most parts that are affected are the ones that draw energy the most, like your brain, your heart, and your reproductive organs. That's what gets hit first. This is just absolute insanity. It's just as insane as putting the fluoride in, the industrial waste fluoride, into our water supply. 1080, it doesn't break down in water. It actually is stable in water. That's how they bring it into the country. 1080, it's brought in sterile water. I started that court case because I was approached by several people around Taranaki who they poisoned the water catchment, and in one area there was one water intake that came off the mountain, and there were 6 people on that line. 4 of them died of cancer, and the 2 others had the same symptoms, and they came to me and said, well, would you help us, do a court case or something, research. So I did, and that's what I found, that their symptoms were typical from 1080 poisoning. And you can read about, the effects of fluorocitrate. Many people, scientists, have done that. They tried to hide the whole thing. I got no coverage on that, in the news. So that's how they roll.
Well, I recently saved a video to one of my playlists that discussed the untouchability of judges in New Zealand.
Well, I've been through that. I fought against Judge for 4 years. I even went to the High Court and the Court of Appeal. Then it went back to the District Court. Then Judge Greg sent me to prison because I wouldn't admit to the fabricated charges that he instigated against me. So I went to Wanganui prison for a week, and while I was in the prison there, in the medium, with all the bros, which was not too bad. So I went to that prison, and then I was pulled out of prison and taken to Hara Court. And while I was in the cell down below, I was visited by the court lawyer, who told me that he had a message from Judge Greg, which was, if I just simply pleaded guilty to all these charges, I could walk out of there, I wouldn't have to go back to prison, and everything would be fine. And so I said, no, I'm not going to plead guilty to charges I haven't done. So then they pulled me back up in the court, and they had to drop the charges because they had none against me. And the court registrar and even the police were saying, Brett, what's happening here? I did the court just to set a timetable for the next court hearing, and then I was whisked off to jail. And then, they put that pressure on me to admit to these charges, and I didn't, But that's what you're up against. So the judges, it is very hard. When I appealed Judge Greg, I went to the High Court, and so when I got to the High Court, I had 7 hearings with 7 different High Court justices, which was a process. They didn't want to hear what I had to say, so they just kept putting people in there, and then they started fabricating things. They firstly said, Justice Kendall was the first justice, and he told me when we went, I paid all the fees, I lodged all the documents, and we went to court. In the first court hearing, he said that he had lost the appeal documents. And then he set court fees against me of $7,000 to go to the next court hearing. And I declined those court fees because I told him, well, you can't set court fees unless you have the documents in front of you, can you? It's not possible, because you have to look at the case and the degree of complexity in the case itself. Well, they'll all be different, so the court fees will be different. Then I went through all the other justices, 6 of them the same thing, and no, they couldn't get me to pay it. And then they did a Justice Cook was the 7th justice, and I got told there's an emergency High Court meeting in New Plymouth tomorrow morning, da-da-da-da-da. So I went there, but this time I went to the police. Before, I went to the police station, and I got an investigation started. They said, oh, someone's stolen my High Court documents. They're telling me that they couldn't find them, for 7 months this has been going on. 10 minutes later, after I told Justice Cook I had a police investigation, he said, oh, we found the documents again. We found them, we had them. Of course they did, because I put them into the registry in hard copy. They had them. But this is what they're doing. It's totally corrupted. The whole system is totally corrupted. That's why I think
So you certainly weren't probably, I imagine, very surprised by the way the government rolled out the Rona Circus. I'm just going to call it the Rona Circus. I don't suppose you'd be surprised by much of anything they do now.
I'm not surprised by anything of that at all. I do know how corrupted it's absolutely corrupted. So it's a bit like I took a court case against Andrew Little, and over what was happening there, what went on, what was displayed in the Pfizer clinical trials. We got the evidence of what was in the Pfizer clinical trials. And that's just, if everyone should have a look at those documents, it's just mind-boggling what's in there, that they absolutely knew the effects of this bioweapon that they released on us. They had seen it in their clinical trials. And after the clinical trials, they had they called it post-authorization trial continued, like they released it to the public. They had over 245,000 adverse events reported, in the first 3 months. You go into the clinical trials and you see their documents. They observed every single disease you could ever imagine occurring after they administered the bioweapon in the trials, because the bioweapon worked on the DNA. It's a DNA altering weapon. So on a cellular level, you had every possible disease you could ever imagine occurring, and they listed them all. This is all confidential information they didn't release. A group in America took 3 court cases and against Pfizer, and they got 100 pages released. That was the 100 pages I went over. I also went over the whole clinical trial. It took me about 2 months because it was so complicated, because they have teams of people who are dedicated to getting the outcome that they want, but also manipulating what they're doing so that no one understands it. And it's a bit like, they know that very few people, they just blind them all with jumbo, lots of jumbo. I'm very good at reading that.
There was a massive campaign, wasn't there? So when people are afraid, they are less creative, they're less inquisitive. So the fear campaign that came with the Rona Circus was huge. It was constant, on the hour, every hour there were updates of how dangerous it was and how many people might die. There was a continual just avalanche of
absolutely
fear.
Because that's the worst thing that we can do, is be in fear, because we lose all our incredible powers that we have to connect to other people. If you're not in fear, you're at a higher, vibrating at a higher level, and humans have this ability to, I believe, to connect up on information if we're all in a good space. When we're in fear, that doesn't happen. We lose all those abilities that we have. So that's why they are constantly putting us in fear. And that's what's happening now, with monkeypox. The whole thing's in fear. So you've got to sort of...
Just going back to, though, I don't want to lose a moment, because you were filmed on the Parliament steps when the Freedom Village was at Parliament, walking up to serve Andrew Little. Is that right? Can you just talk about what happened there?
Yeah, I went down there. I had lodged all the paperwork in the High Court, but I took a civil case, So I had to serve those papers. That's part of the civil case. You have to present them physically to that person. So on that day, might have been the 8th of February, I went up there with the purpose of serving those documents. And on that day, there was a huge police barricade, had formed outside at the bottom of the steps. And the Parliament was in session that day. It was open. But they banned everybody from going up there. Now, if you look in the parliamentary record, you'll see on that day they passed something like 115 bits of legislation. They just pumped through. Well, no one was there. Okay, and so I went to the police and I said, I got these papers to serve, is there any authority that says I can't go up here and serve them? And they didn't reply anything at all, and so I went on my merry way up there. And of course, as you can see on the video, there were 2 other guys came with. I have to say that Destiny Church were there, and they jumped up and told everyone to sit down, not go with me, which was very weird for me at the time. I thought, hey, they're on our side. But that's what happened. They jumped up. So most of the crowd sat down, and 2 guys came with me, and one was really beaten up. I mean, really beaten up. And the other guy was beaten up. I was roughed up. Yeah, so I was on my merry way. And then, I was held, was charged, and that went to, I pleaded not guilty. So 2.5 years later, the charges were that I was disorderly behaviour, inciting violence. Now, when we got to, they had 6 senior sergeants were lined up as witnesses against me. They didn't need 6 policemen or 6 senior sergeants, but they got these 6 senior sergeants, and they came into the court, and I was presented with their affidavits, 6 affidavits, in which they said I was violent and I was throwing my body around at people and swearing profanities and inciting the crowd. Okay, so I quickly read through those, and then I said, okay, I'll get up on the stand. So the policeman got up, the sergeants got up, first one came up, and I said, okay, well, I have a video, somebody shot what happened, so could we please play it to the court? So we played it to the court, and straight away it was obvious. I said, I'm going up there myself, I'm not inciting anyone else to do this. We should do this peacefully, because I'm a great believer in peaceful protests, always have been for the last 30 years. I'm a believer in Toxicity and Mahatma Gandhi and doing things peacefully. We got these guys on the stand, and yeah, they just fell to bits. It was pretty obvious. I said, well, you've said here that I'm violent and we're shouting profanities. Can you show us on the screen now where that was? And of course they couldn't. So then they all just said, they couldn't remember how they had written all this stuff. And there were 6 of them, and the last 4 just said they couldn't remember anything because it was all fabricated. So I continued to...
So people like this, when they go to court, the courts are losing affidavits and documents and evidence, and policemen are forgetting what they said.
It was just insanity, But they had to find me guilty. They were on a mission because I was one of the spokespeople at that protest. They put a lot of effort into finding me guilty. I continued because I wanted to be able to explain in a courtroom the reasons why I did what I did. So I argued with the judge on the day, and I said, well, any defendant should be able to tell the court why they were doing what they were doing. And he had to admit, yes, okay, so he let me go. So I got to say in a courtroom exactly what the reasons why I was doing this over my concerns for the health of New Zealanders. Yeah, I got to put it out there, and I got to say that there's murders being committed here in New Zealand. These people are being murdered. I don't want to muck around and not say the truth here of what's happening. But I've said that in a court, and that was a great thing. People say it on a soapbox or whatever. I'm not afraid to say that because that is the truth. So I said that, and, the judge was very sympathetic to me in the end. He gave me the minimum charge.
I think, John, there are other cases of poisoning. There's other things that happened around Taranaki, and with the 1080 that you're talking about, is that there's very relatively vague outcomes, and the onus is on the people who are suffering with the resulting afflictions to prove it, to prove that that's where the injury came from.
But you can see what happens, like when you go to the court, like I did on the 1080 issue, and then a judge comes in and tries to take your property and remove you from your house, and because they don't want people doing that. Nevertheless, the facts remain. The 1080 transforms into another chemical, which is the active poison, and it's not tested for, and it is in the water, and the government knew that. So they knew. That's what's in the, that's why they didn't want any publicity going on what I was doing in the courts. They knew. And as I said, the government did their own experiments. They knew every molecule of 1080 transforms to fluorocitrate if it's in water with microorganisms. And same in all of, whatever it is, it gets transformed to fluorocitrate. So we should have been testing for fluorocitrate.
Yeah, you explained that really well. I didn't understand that. I didn't know that. You've explained it really well.
That's the great con that people in New Zealand need to understand. They're being poisoned. This fluorocitrate's going directly into your water catchments everywhere throughout New Zealand. So you're getting long-term poisoning, which is causing fertility problems, miscarriages. We know that all around New Zealand, all the miscarriages, birth miscarriages that were happening. So many people lost children because they had the unfortunate fluorocitrate got into their system and just kills any fetuses. They know that. They absolutely know that.
Yeah, well, I think microbiomes are incredibly important. There's a lot more emphasis now on the gut microbiome being the seat of our immunity and good health. And it does sound like what you're describing is very dangerous for the gut microbiome. I actually know 2 people who've been poisoned with 1080. One was a woman who lived up around Maruia. She was hiking in the forest, and they were doing a 1080 drop. And she went into the forest. Now she was in the forest all the time. She was a real outdoors girl. She went into the forest, and the helicopter dumped a load of 1080 over her and her sister, but she got the mother load and she inhaled the dust. It nearly killed her, and she's not well now. The second one that I knew, and she's probably going to have a shortened life, and when they came out of the bush, her sister was sick herself. She couldn't walk. She practically had to be carried, and dragged out by her sister. They said, serves you right, you greenies or your protesters, or serves you right. They used some slurs. So they appeared that they'd known what they were doing. It was malicious. The other one was a man. He was a dock employee. Now, this is interesting what happened to him. He got poisoned by 1080 in the bush, and it munted his endocrine system as well as it did other organ damage in his system. But when his hormones stopped working right, he was actually advised to be a woman. So you're not really a man anymore. You're more of a woman. And he was put on a series of synthetic hormones and surgeries. Now, when a gift is not a gift, he actually was just very sick. And the synthetic drugs, he's dead. He's dead. And, adults making your own decision is one thing, but everybody should get all the information for what's going to happen to. So I met, and a lot of people would say I met, well, I won't say the name actually, may they rest in peace, really suffered in the last years of their life. Really suffered.
Make fear of the people who have been poisoned by eating wild game, wild pork. There's a family in Hamilton, an Indian family, and they were given some pork that a hunter had hunted. What happens with the pigs, a lot of the time, they'll take the 1080 and they're very robust. They might not die, but their whole body becomes filled up with contaminated fluorocitrate. So then the hunters come along, like in case they shot the pig, and then they took it back and they gave it to this Indian family. And the whole Indian family went down, the father, the mother, the kids, and maybe one of the grandparents. They immediately just started having convulsions, and they were taken and put into a hospital, and the medical people came and said, oh, this looks like, it's not 1080, it's, they gave it another, I was trying to think what they did call call it. But yeah, they just refused to admit, that it was possibly 1080. And those people were so sick, they had to survive. And when they came out at the end after about 4 months, after being strapped down because they were having massive convulsions, their lives were wrecked, like they were just not the same,
Yeah, I recall a lot of people were talking
Yeah,
about this
it was
poor
an example
family
of how
that this went through. So
completely
with this in your history and your experience, knowing what you're up against, turns out that you weren't finished because you've found something really important that we need to talk about. So shall we move on to that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a good example to start with because it outlines the corruption of everything, the degree of corruption. So, yeah, you can use that as a background to what we're going to talk about here, which is about how this government has been bought out. The people that we have in government aren't doing anything for us. They're just puppets for the World Economic United Nations agenda. The two go together because they formed an official partnership, I think 2019. So the agenda is just coming through the World Economic Forum, which is a group of super rich people who have never been elected, just like the WHO, the World Health Organization. They're not elected to have any sovereignty over us. The problem is all the governments of the world have all been bought out. There's 194 governments. They say they've signed to this agreement with the World Health Organization, but that hasn't been finalized. That's still not finalized. But what I'm saying is all the governments in the whole world have sold us out. So that's where the problem starts. You've got these people who are supposed to be representing us who don't care at all about us. They are just on the payroll. They've been paid out massive amounts, people with all this money, and they just do what they're told. So, yeah, that's a very, very big problem. And people need to recognize where the problem is coming from. You see, the people that control the whole world, and there's a small amount of them, there's a committee of 300. They call it the Committee of 300 that sits above the World Economic Forum, and above that there's another committee of 7 families that run everything. Now, they're the people we should be looking at bringing to justice, those people. They sit in silence, and they've done this for 100 years or maybe more. They orchestrate all these horrific repression of the whole world and the people of the world. They have organized this action of humanity, and they sit in silence. And they put these structures in place, these political structures, so that there will be a buffer from the general population. So the general population won't even know who is behind this. So if you've got a problem, you have to identify where it's coming from. Around the world at the moment.
So it is shaped a lot like.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a pyramid shape. Yeah. But the point I'm getting at is most of the world is not awake yet as to who's doing this. And if you want to solve the problem, we need to start looking at them. And we need to see that these people that speak to us, the politicians, are just puppets, that they're not the cause of it. So what the people at the top want is they want the masses to fight amongst themselves. They want us to be divided and have a conflict, whether that be a race war, as is happening now all around the world. These people are creating the race wars. Absolutely. The race wars that have happened in England that have led to the instigation of a totalitarian system now where nobody can speak, where thousands of people are put in jail, journalists as well.
Minnie Brown is Brett Powers. Protest plan of action. We must all commence a plan of action demanding answers from our elected representatives to explain how a government health department is claiming it now has the authority to arrest, detain, isolate, jab anyone and also requisition our homes, cars and any possessions without our consent and with the force of the police. No such authority exists. I have included the required information you will need. Document 1 is the list of powers that the government now claim is actionable from the recently released Epidemic Preparedness Plan. Document 2 is the list of amendments made to the Health Act 1956, showing that new special powers claimed were never passed through the required 3 parliamentary readings and granting of royal assent by the Governor-General. Instead, as shown on Document 2, these new powers were inserted in 2021 by a Health Department initiative to insert these totalitarian powers without any public parliamentary scrutiny, in secret from the public with no notifications made to the media. It is claimed by Section 3 of the Secondary Legislation Act 2021. The Legislation Act 2019 requires all secondary legislation to be published in the Gazette, Section 69, 1C. The Legislation Act 2019 also requires that the minister responsible, the Minister of Health, must present any new secondary legislation to the House of Representatives, Section 114, Schedule 1, Clause 32, 1A. A simple search of the parliamentary record shows clearly the Minister of Health never fulfilled the statutory authority of presenting the secondary legislation claimed by the Health Department to the Parliament, media or public. A simple search of Gazette publication shows clearly nothing was published in the Gazette to announce the inserted Health Department amendments. Therefore, the stated authority claimed is null and void, and criminal actions have been taken to attempt to state the contrary. Therefore, both the Labour Party and the National Party have acted with deceit and deception in breach of the Crimes Act 1961, Section 240. Therefore, criminal charges have already been lodged in the District Court Wellington against Christopher Mark Luxon. Criminal charges will now also be lodged against the Minister of Health at the time, Andrew James Little, and Director General of Health at the time, Ashley Robin Bloomfield. Therefore, any officers of representatives of either party would be a good protest point to demand a response as to now how both parties have acted with such deceit to attempt to impose such drastic totalitarian rules against the people of New Zealand in secrecy and without informing the public who they serve as public servants. The Wellington Parliament will also be a good point of protest. This time, the criminal charges will be served by the Ministry of Justice. Pass the documents to your elected representative, and if no response is given, commence a protest outside the representative's local office. We should do this all around the country, always acting peacefully, knowing we are acting within the law. Extra information. Please screenshot if necessary.